My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33. And the night my husband stood in our living room and told me he was leaving me for a richer woman, he said something that still echoes in my head. "You've always been comfortable living small, Emily. I want more out of life." A week later, he walked into the Monday executive meeting at his company, took his usual seat near the end of the conference table, and realized the woman sitting at the head of it was me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the truth is, when Daniel walked out that night, he believed he was trading up. What he didn't know was that he had just divorced the person who owned every paycheck he'd ever earned for the last 4 years. And the moment he realized that was the moment his entire world collapsed. But to understand how it got that far, you need to understand something about my marriage, and about Daniel, and about the secret I kept from almost everyone in my life. 3 weeks before the divorce, my life looked painfully ordinary. I woke up every morning at 6:30 in our 2-bedroom townhouse in Arlington. The place wasn't fancy. Beige siding, small kitchen, slightly crooked cabinets the landlord kept promising to fix. Daniel used to joke that our place looked like something from a starter home catalog. "Temporary," he'd always say. "One day we'll upgrade." I'd smile when he said that, because technically he wasn't wrong, but the upgrade he imagined and the one I had planned were very different things. My mornings were quiet. Coffee first, emails second. Daniel usually woke around 8. He worked as a regional operations manager for a fast-growing tech logistics company called Vector Dynamics. It was a mid-level job, good salary, decent benefits, and Daniel talked about it like it was the first step to something bigger. "You should see the people in the executive wing," he told me once. "Private offices, real money. That's the level I'm heading toward." I remember stirring my coffee that morning and just nodding. "I'm sure you will," I said. He thought my calm meant I believed in his ambition. In reality, it meant I already knew how the story would end. Daniel loved appearances. That was the simplest way to describe him. The right watch, the right restaurant reservations, the right kind of friends. When we met 6 years earlier, I thought it was confidence. Later, I realized it was something else. Validation. Daniel needed people to see him as successful, needed it like oxygen. And for the first few years of our marriage, I played my part perfectly. Quiet wife, remote consultant, flexible hours. Nothing flashy, nothing that threatened his image as the successful one. He never asked many questions about my work, and I never offered many answers. That arrangement worked until it didn't. The shift started slowly. It always does. Little comments at first, little comparisons. One night at dinner, Daniel mentioned a coworker named Lauren Whitmore. "She just bought a penthouse downtown," he said casually while scrolling through his phone. 32nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass. Unreal place. I remember glancing up. "Sounds nice," I said. "She's 31, he continued. "Some people just move faster in life." There was something in his tone, something sharp, like the comment wasn't about Lauren at all, it was about me. I let it pass, but that night was the first time I wondered whether Daniel had started measuring my value against other people's bank accounts. A month later, Lauren's name came up again, this time during a company holiday party. Vector Dynamics rented out an upscale rooftop bar downtown. Daniel insisted I come. "Networking," he said. "Spouses are expected." The rooftop overlooked the city lights. Glass railings, white lounge furniture, expensive cocktails. I stood beside Daniel as he introduced me to a few coworkers. Most were polite, friendly, but when Lauren Whitmore walked in, the entire dynamic shifted. She was exactly the kind of person Daniel admired. Tall, impeccably dressed, confidence that filled a room. Someone whispered that her family owned multiple real estate developments across the East Coast. Old money, serious money. Daniel watched her enter the room like gravity had changed direction. "That's Lauren," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. She was laughing with a group of executives near the bar, and then she looked over. Our eyes met for half a second. There was a flicker of recognition in her expression, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel didn't notice, but I did, because Lauren Whitmore already knew exactly who I was, and that moment was the first time I realized something dangerous was starting to happen. But what Daniel didn't understand yet was that the power dynamic in that room was nothing like he believed, and the truth behind that realization would explode just a few weeks later, the night my husband asked for a divorce and thought he had won. Emily Carter here again. The strange thing about that party was how normal it looked on the surface. Music playing softly, people laughing, bartenders shaking cocktails behind a glowing marble bar. Daniel moved through the room like he belonged there, shaking hands, talking about quarterly numbers, smiling at people who were 2 levels above him in the company hierarchy. And every so often, his eyes drifted back to Lauren Whitmore. It wasn't subtle. He admired her the way some people admire luxury cars and showroom windows, not necessarily because they understood them, but because they symbolized success. I stood beside him most of the evening, sipping sparkling water and listening to conversations about logistics networks and expansion strategies.
At one point, Daniel leaned closer and whispered, almost conspiratorially, "Lauren's family is worth hundreds of millions," he said. "Real estate, investments, the whole empire thing." I nodded. "Sounds impressive." He smirked. "Imagine being connected to that kind of money." I didn't respond, because there was a quiet irony in that moment that Daniel couldn't possibly see. The truth was, the wealth he was admiring across the room had nothing to do with the real power inside Vector Dynamics, and if he had known who actually controlled the company's majority stake, he might have looked at his own wife very differently. But secrets are strange things. Sometimes they sit quietly in the background for years, until one moment forces them into the open. About halfway through the night, Daniel stepped away to talk with one of the regional directors. That's when Lauren walked over. Up close, she looked even more polished than she had from across the room. Designer heels, minimal jewelry, the kind of confidence that comes from growing up surrounded by wealth. She stopped a few feet from me and smiled. Not the polite smile people use at networking events, a knowing one. "Emily Carter," she said. It wasn't a question. I returned the smile. "Lauren Whitmore." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "So he never told them?" I shook my head. "No reason to." For a moment, we both just stood there, 2 women in a crowded rooftop bar, sharing a quiet understanding that nobody else in the room was aware of. Lauren glanced across the room where Daniel was still talking animatedly with his colleagues. Then she leaned slightly closer to me. "You know, he talks about moving up here someday," she said. "Executive level." I laughed softly. "I've heard." She studied my expression for a second, like she was trying to read something behind it. "That could get complicated," she added. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Lauren tilted her head toward the glass elevators across the room, because eventually he'd have to meet the owner. For a split second, the corner of my mouth twitched. "Eventually," I said. Lauren's smile widened just a fraction, and then she picked up a champagne flute from a passing tray. "Well," she said casually, "I guess we'll see how things unfold." With that, she walked away, leaving me standing there with a strange mixture of amusement and curiosity, because I had just realized something important. Lauren knew my secret, and she had just hinted that she might not keep it forever. When Daniel returned, he was buzzing with excitement. "Did you see who just left?" he asked. "The CEO came by for a few minutes." I raised an eyebrow. "Did you meet him?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but I will someday." There was that tone again, that quiet certainty that the future would place him exactly where he believed he belonged. He draped an arm around my shoulders. "You know what I realized tonight?" he said. "I've been thinking too small." I glanced up at him. "How so?" "I'm surrounded by people who are building real wealth," he said. "Connections matter. Position matters. Being tied to the right people changes everything." I held his gaze. "Is that what you want?" He didn't hesitate. "Of course." Then he smiled at me, but there was something distant behind it, like his mind was already somewhere else, somewhere bigger, somewhere richer. At the time, I didn't know exactly how far his ambition would take him, or how quickly, but I was about to find out, because less than 2 weeks later, Daniel sat across from me at our kitchen table and calmly told me he wanted a divorce, and the reason he gave me was someone I had already met. It was a Tuesday evening, rain tapping against the kitchen window. Daniel came home later than usual. He didn't kiss me hello, didn't ask about my day. He just set his briefcase on the counter and said quietly, "We need to talk." That phrase always carries weight, even before the words that follow. I dried my hands on a towel and sat down across from him. He didn't look nervous. He looked resolved, like he had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Emily," he began, "I think we've grown in different directions." I watched him carefully. "That happens sometimes," I said. He exhaled slowly. "I've met someone." There it was. Simple, clean, direct. I felt a small sting in my chest, not because I didn't expect change in our marriage someday, but because of how calm he seemed about dismantling the life we'd built together. "Who?" I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated for half a second. Then he said the name, Lauren Whitmore. And suddenly, the entire puzzle snapped into place. The funny thing about betrayal is that sometimes it doesn't shock you the way you expect. Sometimes it just confirms what you already suspected. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "How long?" I asked. "A few weeks," he admitted. "We connected after the holiday party." Of course you did, I thought. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, she understands the world I want to build." There it was again, the same quiet message hidden beneath his words. Ambition, status, money. He continued, "Her family's involved in some major investments. There are opportunities there I can't ignore." I studied him for a moment. "So you're leaving me? For opportunity?" He winced slightly. "It's more complicated than that." But we both knew it wasn't. The truth was painfully simple. Daniel believed he was upgrading his life, trading a modest marriage for something bigger, something richer, something more impressive. And the cruelest part, he genuinely believed I had nothing to offer that could compete with that. We finalized the divorce surprisingly quickly. Daniel didn't fight over assets, mostly because he assumed there weren't many. The townhouse was a rental, our joint savings account was modest, and I never mentioned the investment portfolios or holding companies tied quietly to my name. To Daniel, I was just Emily, the quiet consultant with flexible hours, the woman who never seemed interested in chasing wealth. He signed the divorce papers with almost casual relief, like he was closing a chapter that had become inconvenient. As he stood up from the lawyer's office, he gave me a polite smile. "I hope you find what makes you happy." I returned the smile. "You too, Daniel." And then he walked out of my life, convinced he had made the smartest decision of his career. What he didn't know was that exactly 7 days later, his job would require him to attend an executive strategy meeting, and for the first time in his life, he would come face to face with the person who actually owned the company he worked for, the person sitting at the head of the table, the person approving the next round of promotions and restructures, the person who had just finalized a very quiet divorce from him. Me.